Okay, so this lecture is on texture. Let's find a definition here. Texture is the surface characteristics of a piece we can feel if we touch it. Its hardness, softness, bumpiness, smoothness, sharpness, furriness, or whatever. Texture is one of those things that makes us want to explore a piece more. When we can touch it, or when we can't touch it, we sort of imagine how it feels. But our eyes can be fooled. Sometimes artists work with visual or implied texture, and that's the apparent rather than the actual surface of the piece. Texture is often not the first thing we notice in a work. We might look at its contours, materials, the scale, and then we'll move in a little more closely. On this work by Louise Nevelson, the texture demands our immediate attention. This is called First Personage. It's sort of a passive-aggressive piece. It's got smooth and soft on one side, where we have kind of natural texture over here. And then we've got this spiky, prickly side over here, this worked side of the piece. It's called First Personage, as I said, makes you think that this is an abstract of a human form. So lots of economy here, perhaps. No head. This is sort of a torso. And then this prickly backbone sort of affair going on. Lots of economy. I can see it being a figurative piece. I don't know whether you would or not. I also wanted to point out that these spikes back here also make this an activated space. We're going to start throwing in more terms about the principles. Remember, that's a space that goes beyond just the actual item. And so sometimes when there's prickly things out there, people want to stand back, either because they feel uncomfortable going close because it might hurt them, or because they might break it, or for whatever reason. But activated space, potential economy here. So there are three different sections I'm going to talk about in texture. There's natural texture, worked texture, and visual texture. So let's take natural texture first. And that's where artists use a material directly as it comes from nature. In this case, this is Walter de Maria. It's called Earth Room. It was an installation in a New York gallery, often very sterile white walls, very sharp, kind of a cold space. And he filled this room with 250 cubic yards of this nice, soft dirt to contrast with the sterile white walls of the gallery. So there's not a whole lot of open space. Well, that's not true. There's Central Park. But, when you're walking down the streets of any big city, you're often not confronted with big fields, plowed areas, etc. So he wanted to bring in, and actually this was in the late 70s, which is a time where New York was not at its finest. But he wanted to bring in this material with all of its natural smell and texture, just to make people kind of aware of the contrasts of what they were living in with maybe these stark man-made structures. Here's another artist rendering. This is a piece that was made by Hawaiian Islanders. They were making a sculpture of a head, but what they were using here are natural textures. The face is made up of little feathers. There's real hair and fur, shell for the eyes to get that kind of shimmering look, dog teeth. There's some wood down here. So using natural materials just in their natural state. Here you've seen this before. This is Martin Puryear. In this piece, he uses a lot of wood. In this piece, he has taken this, cut off this bump out on the side of a tree with all of its natural texture right here. And then he cut it on 5 sides here, including the bottom. That's actually worked texture. This is worked texture. Worked back here. Worked, worked, worked. Where a human has taken a tool to it in some way, right? But here we have a piece that's got worked and natural texture. And here we have good old natural texture there. I just threw that in so you could see how artists are inspired to use natural materials. This is an artist named Blanc who uses, the only reason I remember him is when I was in school, outside the dorms, there was this huge seating kind of sculpture, a participatory space, right? We talked about that before. And it was about 8 feet by 10 feet by about 4 feet tall. A big seating area that students could go sit in and chat or just hang out. But you can see he leaves a lot of the areas of his work just in its natural state, but then does a lot of other working with real rich textures in the wood. Isamu Noguchi is another person who likes to work stone surfaces and wood surfaces, but also leave them natural. In this case, to break a piece of stone from another larger stone, sometimes you put these sort of metal kind of chisel affairs in it and then keep whacking at it until it chips off. So you can see that part has been worked, but where it naturally just chipped away, you can see that natural texture next to this work texture. Here's some natural texture of this. This is Georgia O'Keeffe, the famous painter from New Mexico. You remember her work with cattle skulls and big pictures of flowers and things like that. You painters will all know her. Anyway, she's got a very wonderful face full of character. And another artist, Mari Sol, wanted to do a portrait of her. So looking at her older face, she worked, here was a big chunk of wood, right? Worked wood, and worked it even more, chiseled it out, and left a lot of that texture on the face to give her an aged and softened features on her face. But this stone is natural. The stick is natural. This is an actual head of this horned animal, more worked wood. So more people kind of working with worked and natural textures. This is a beautiful piece by an artist named Hans Håkansson. It almost looks like it's because of this kind of doweling in here. It almost looks like it could be a kinetic piece. I don't know if it is. It probably isn't. He probably just wanted to use this sort of joinery with using a dowel to hold the pieces together. But here you see how you can take a hard piece of wood and just by using tools give it a very, kind of a softness about it. This is an interesting texture. This is by an artist who uses rubber tires and shreds them. So they take, these old tires, shreds them, and makes something look very soft. Let's see, I've got a quote here, what this artist has to say about this. The title of this is, "It's So Hard to Be Green." And she says, when you're working with found materials, each one comes with its own purpose, history, and use. Like a painter having a palette, my palette is the textures of the treads. the fibers from discarded materials, and tires that I use to create varied effects. I've heard that tires can last up to 2,000 years. I'm excited to be using a material that has been a foundation for this country and the world. I've used tires to translate ideas of universal importance into visual works. I am delighted that I was able to bring tires into the art world. Well, I find that really interesting. I mean, I really like this piece, and I'm glad that she's recycling something that would normally get, I don't know what. I mean, people used to burn these things and put horrible smoke and toxic things into the air. I don't know. Actually, that piece was made in 2000. I don't know why they're so excited about, celebrating tires at this point, at this day and age. But anyway, there it is, and people can change. But it is a very cool piece, and wonderful how to take something so rigid and really not, I don't think, the most pleasant thing to touch into something that you want to come up and feel, actually. This is called Land Rollers. It's by an artist named Ursula von Reidingsvard. Let's see here. Where's my notes on this? There are 17 of these cedar logs, and they're 14 feet wide here, 14 feet long. And they've got this chiseled scarification on the sides of them. And I think this is thrown in here. So you guys really were so attracted to the texture even before the form. I mean, usually, you want to look at the form, but this, the texture of this chiseling, the scarification, and then she rubbed graphite into it to kind of deepen the look of those scars, those wounds, so to speak. It's kind of an interesting piece. It refers to her and her family who survived 8 years in a forced labor camp in Germany. So, I mean, it almost looks like, like Sisyphus pushing a rock up a hill sort of thing. Kind of, labor, maybe without any real fruitfulness about it, except scarring and wounds. I don't know, kind of a heavy piece. Here's another piece with worked texture. This is alabaster, so that's how you get this really interesting light that's coming through the stone here. But here you can see people using texture just for contrast. This is called Saint Margaret and the Dragon. So the dragon and her hair have all this wonderful left kind of matte texture. And then the body of Saint Margaret here is very smooth. So that's what really draws our attention here, besides the glow here. Maybe that's because she's a saint. This piece, it's figurative. It's also, I would say, economical. And why does she say that? Okay, so here's this dragon. We don't see a whole lot. We see the head here. We're not seeing a whole lot of its other body parts. We're seeing her body here, but not a whole lot of details. Her face is very smooth. So that's economy when we're not, she doesn't have, little lines around her elbows and such. And really, folks, for the most part, most sculpture is economical. It's like a spectrum, from one degree to another. So you're going to see pieces that are extremely stripped down and pieces that aren't so stripped down. But there is economy going in on this piece. Okay, here's more people using worked texture, in this case, working the land here, but also having natural texture. This is an ecological installation, also in Lower Manhattan. 2 acres of wheat that she planted over this big rubble-covered landfill. And she also wanted to point out the contrast between these big, hard, geometric, rectangular masonry buildings in the background and these waving stalks of grain and the feel of them, the sound of them, and the smell of them. To call people's attention to having to rethink their priorities was a quote from her. So worked texture, but then natural texture here. Okay, here's some more worked texture. This is also a very economical piece. This is called Falling Man. Now you're gonna have to look at this a little bit. Okay, it looks like some kind of weird car that could be going pretty quickly. I mean, and the reason we get that feeling of movement, one's the sleekness and the shininess of these lines here, the angle that it's going down, so we can tell it's already starting to have some propulsion there. So where's the falling man part? So we see this kind of lump here and we think, okay, that sort of looks like a belly. And then we've got these 2 appendages that go down. Those obviously look like thighs, thigh muscles, knees, coming down here into the feet. So that leaves the head or the upper torso up here. I've never seen this piece, so I couldn't tell you, but you can start to see that, yes, this is a figurative piece of work. It's very abstracted. It's very economical because we can tell that that's a human, a figurative piece, but we don't have a whole lot of details there. That's what we call economy on this. The other cool thing about the surface on here is it is so highly polished that helps us think about that speeding car idea and reflecting what else is around it. Falling man. Okay, this is the face of a Waka man in Africa. Now, in our culture, we really value smooth skin. I mean, you can open up any fashion magazine and see that and hear about how you can make yours better and smoother by buying certain products. Other cultures have other values, and in this culture, having this scarification, this very ordered, patterned, repetitious, raised texture on the face is for them beauty. I mean, in our culture, we just sort of think about the pain that person endured. But there again, beauty, like all art, is in the eye of the beholder. Okay, this piece of worked texture, you got your sheep, you take the fleece off the sheep, you spin it, you turn it into wool, so you've kind of worked that natural texture. And then this person wove this beautiful cape here. And what I wanted you to notice here was sort of, repeated texture here. So we've got repetition. It's a very organic feeling, very rhythmic in the way that they designed it and the way it flows when it's worn. The proportions, it's to fit a human body. Let's take a look at balance. It is symmetrical, right? Pretty even from side to side. If you put a mirror on one side, it would pretty much look like the other. So we've got repetition, variety, rhythm. The emphasis would be these fasteners with all the variety of these little ball kinds of affairs here. We've got proportion, that it's to fit its human proportion here, and our symmetrical balance. Okay. A lot of times when we see a figurative piece, humans are pretty symmetrical. But this piece, since it is, frozen in time, this is one of those ones where you could say, well, it's, it's human, it's symmetrical, but really not. I mean, here, the way they have this clothing draped over the shoulder, the headpiece is a little bit off, the neck is turned, the buttons go up one side, and then the little loops go up the other. So even though we would normally say it's basically symmetrical, it is asymmetrical. But what I really wanted you to look at here is our first example of visual texture. And remember, that is texture that doesn't correspond with the actual texture. So we are looking at this and thinking, oh, look at the beautiful drape of this wonderful clothing, this voluminous clothing. But in fact, this is stone, right? This is jasper. Upper part of the body here is jasper. The skin, the face is bronze. This is also jasper up here, and another stone down here. So taking hard, cold, rigid stone and making it look soft like cloth and facial skin. So this is visual texture, not what the real texture is. This, here again, this is actually made of clay. This whole case is made of clay, except for the latches here are real metal that she added to it. But she's got the patina down here. It looks like really, worn, somebody's lovely piece of luggage, right, that they've touched and carried and used for many, many years. This is by Marilyn Levine. As I say, it's made of clay. This is what we would call a trompe-l'oeil artwork, which in French means fool the eye, trompe-l'oeil. I'll show you another one here, and you'll recognize this artist. This is Richard Shaw. You've seen his work before, I think I think it was our terms quiz part A. So a lot of you guys got a little bit confused by this. You really thought those were found objects, so he would be delighted. This is all made out of cast clay. None of this is real wood, real paint cans, real wooden spools, a real orange, real paintbrush, real whatever that is, some kind of dowel thing, real paper down here, real tube of paint. This is all clay. He takes the objects, he makes molds of them, he casts those molds with liquid clay we call slip. So, and then he paints them to look like the actual objects, trompe-l'oeil, fool the eye. You would see this, and many of you did see that and say, oh, well, that's just found objects. But no, trompe-l'oeil, fool the eye. This is a figurative piece. It is asymmetrical, right? I mean, it's not equally balanced on both sides, particularly from this view. The emphasis, well, and emphasis is really sort of subjective in a way. Some of you may be attracted to this biggest, brightest because it's white thing, sort of kind of in the middle of the piece. Maybe your eye is attracted to that first, or maybe it's this orange up on top. There again, we want to look at the face of this thing, and so, but what do we find? We find an orange. So anyway, then it as I say, that's kind of a subjective thing where your eye is drawn. But for me, it's this big glaring white. the biggest, boldest form here in the center. So an artist creating visual texture, not the real texture. And sometimes people make visual texture just because they think it's more attractive. This is a paw foot sewing machine. And they just wanted it to look more pleasing than just, this could have just been a cylinder. They didn't have to make these textured animal claw feet or paw feet. They could have just left it very plain, but they thought, and in the time that this was made, probably in the last century, or maybe even before, they thought that things were more attractive by adding these beautiful textures. And this is a piece by David Smith. Not to fool the eye, but the texture that was added to this was to sort of, it just roughs up the surface just to sort of make an interesting kind of calligraphic, almost graffiti-like texture on there. But it also reflects light in an interesting way. It sort of also gives it an optical illusion of softness there again on this hard surface. This looks like a pretty symmetrical piece from this angle. The surface texture is not symmetrical. It looks figurative to me. This looks like a head, the torso in the middle, coming down to two legs. If that's the case, this is very economical. This is a representation of a human without putting arms, facial features, feet, real legs. It is a representation. It's very economical. We get the sense of a human here without really many details at all, except some vague reference to legs. And then the proportions kind of a human body. So I think that's kind of it. Let's see. Oh, this was just something I tossed on to the end here. We've got, this is just a ceramic pot that has volume in here, right? There's an inner form inside here, a measurable space inside this pot. We've got worked texture on the outside. Also, by the way that they added the coloration of the glaze here, we get this more of a sense of visual texture here too. Also, you can see with the little spots on these trout on the sides. And with that high gloss glaze, it gives you a real sense of what using visual texture, of what sense of what that slippery fish might feel like. So anyway, that's texture, natural texture, worked texture, and visual texture.